What's the hardest thing you've had to forgive, or never could?
When my app hit 1 million in revenue, I didn't call anyone. I didn't post a selfie or even explain what the numbers meant. I just took a screenshot of the striped dashboard, black background, white text, one simple figure, $1,012,458.73, and uploaded it to Facebook. No caption. No context. Not even a humble brag. Within an hour, my phone lit up like Times Square. First my brother, then my mom, then my cousin Heather, who hadn't texted me since her wedding, and eventually my husband, whose voicemail just said, "We need to talk about what this means." And all I could think about was the first time I told them what I was working on. They laughed. All of them. Like I'd said I was opening a hamster circus or applying to be an astronaut. But what really burned wasn't the laughter. It was how easily they moved on, how quickly they returned to talking about my brother Jake's podcast as if that was the only thing in the room worth clapping for. Jake is 2 years younger than me, a charming underachiever with a radio voice and a whole lot of potential, which, in our family, is a currency that never seems to expire. I swear, that guy could have set a lawn chair on fire in my parents' backyard, and they would have called it an art installation. He's always been working on something, which usually meant buying domain names and dreaming up titles like Bark Frequency, a podcast for dog energy. That one actually got him a $20,000 loan from my parents, who proudly called it an investment in the creative economy. I, on the other hand, had been working quietly for almost 2 years on a simple SaaS tool designed for freelancers to manage invoices, track clients, and negotiate contracts without needing a full business team behind them. Nothing sexy. Nothing viral. Just smart, boring, functional software that solved a real problem. But every time I mentioned it, I got polite smiles and those awful, empty compliments like, "That's nice," or "sounds technical," or my personal favorite, "just don't get your hopes up." I remember the moment it all solidified for me, Thanksgiving, 2 years ago. Jake stood at the head of the table, holding his phone out like it was the Constitution, playing his podcast trailer on Bluetooth while everyone clapped like he'd won an Emmy. It was him talking about the emotional language of golden retrievers. My dad laughed until he cried. My mom wiped a tear and said she was proud of how creative he was. Then they turned to me and asked if I'd found a new job yet. I wasn't unemployed. I had a freelance gig in UX design, paying the bills while I bootstrapped my app. But to them, unless it came with a title and a name badge, it wasn't real work. After dinner, my husband David leaned over and asked me, not even privately, "You're still doing that little side thing, right?" That little side thing. I smiled, said yes, and excused myself to the bathroom where I locked the door and stared at my reflection for a full minute, wondering why I even bothered to show up for people who'd already made up their minds about what I was worth. That night, after everyone had gone to bed, I opened my laptop and worked until dawn. Not because I had something to prove to them, but because I finally accepted that they would never see me unless I showed them something they couldn't ignore. Something they couldn't laugh off. I didn't have connections. I didn't have capital. I didn't have a husband who believed in the idea. In fact, David treated the whole thing like it was my version of knitting or taking up meditation. I remember once, during a dinner with his friends, he referred to me as kind of semi-retired right now, just exploring some online projects. It took everything in me not to throw my wine in his lap. But I bit my tongue again, like I always did. And when we got home that night, I lay awake while he snored, thinking about how alone I really was. Every dollar I put into the app came from my freelance work. I stopped going out. I skipped vacations. I learned to cook just to avoid spending money on takeout. There were nights when I doubted everything, especially when a competitor launched a similar product with a massive ad budget, and I watched my tiny user base shrink by 20% overnight. I cried in the shower. I cursed in the dark. But I never stopped. Because I knew what I was building had value, even if no one else could see it yet. Even if my own family thought I was playing business while my brother followed his dreams. The irony? His podcast never got past episode 6. After the buzz wore off and the equipment gathered dust in the spare room, my parents quietly stopped mentioning it. No one asked for the money back. No one acknowledged the failure. It just disappeared, like it had never happened, while I kept coding, designing, emailing, testing, every night, every weekend, in between contract gigs and grocery runs and pretending not to be hurt when David reminded me that real businesses scale fast or fail fast. So, when I finally posted that screenshot, I wasn't bragging. I wasn't looking for validation. I was simply done being invisible. I was done waiting for someone to take me seriously. That number, that $1 million mark, it didn't erase the years of doubt, or the moments I felt like a ghost at my own dinner table, but it did something better. It made them pause. It made them wonder. And for once, it made them shut up. But here's the real question, the one I'm still turning over in my head. When people only show up after you've made it, do they deserve a seat at the table? Because my phone's still ringing. Jake's still texting. David's still asking about our financial future. And me? I haven't decided whether to answer. Yet? There's a strange kind of silence that comes after years of being talked over, a silence that doesn't come from shyness or submission, but from the slow realization that some people, especially the ones you expected the most from, will never truly see you beyond the version they've already built in their heads. And I think it was sometime around the spring of last year when I stopped trying to explain what I was doing and simply started building in peace, not because I didn't want to share the process, but because every time I tried, the responses I got were either condescending or absurdly disconnected from the actual work I was pouring my soul into. My brother Jake, for example, was now pivoting from his dog podcast, which had fizzled out in record time after he ran out of episodes and sponsors refused to pay for his dream of animated dog guests, into what he described at dinner one evening as a next-gen crypto art venture for pet lovers. And I remember sitting there across the table from him, watching my father nod with that classic proud dad expression like Jake had just announced he was curing cancer, while I sat there with my half-eaten salad, biting my tongue so hard I tasted blood, knowing that just the night before, I'd crossed $10,000 in revenue for my app for the very first time, a milestone I hadn't shared with anyone, not even my husband, because I knew what would happen if I did. And I was right, because when I finally mentioned, in the most casual, passing way I could manage, that my app had started making actual money, real, trackable, recurring revenue from real users across 6 countries, my mother blinked, smiled, and said, "Oh honey, that's cute. I'm glad your little project is keeping you busy," before pivoting the conversation back to Jake's investor deck that he'd apparently been working on with someone from a startup incubator who turned out to be his old roommate from college who once sold weed from a dorm room. There's a moment, if you've ever been underestimated long enough, you'll understand it, a moment when the humiliation stops stinging and starts hardening, like emotional scar tissue, and you start to find power in not being seen, in being ignored. Because invisibility, when paired with determination, becomes its own kind of advantage, and in my case, it meant I could make moves no one expected, test features no one was tracking, and scale without the pressure of performance or the noise of everyone trying to help. That month, my app quietly reached 50 users, then 70, then over 100 active accounts, with freelancers messaging me directly, thanking me for creating something that finally didn't feel like it was built for Silicon Valley tech bros or bloated agencies, but for people like them, people juggling clients, chasing invoices, and trying to make a living without needing a damn MBA to read a dashboard. Still, inside my own home, the atmosphere hadn't changed. If anything, David had grown colder, not overtly, but in that subtle, passive-aggressive way that makes everything feel like a performance review. He'd glance at my screen when he passed behind me. Not to ask questions, but to point out the flaws, suggesting that my UI looked a little too basic or that I should maybe get some help before it all crashes. And when I told him I was thinking about hiring someone part-time to help with back-end development, he laughed, not cruelly, but in that way that tells you someone doesn't take you seriously no matter what you do, and said, "Maybe get a proof of concept first before you start playing CEO." Proof of concept. I wanted to scream. I wanted to show him the Stripe reports, the growth metrics, the user feedback emails that made me cry some nights, because strangers saw more value in me than the man I shared a bed with. But I didn't. I just nodded, smiled, and saved the receipts for later. Because I was learning that revenge doesn't always look like confrontation. Sometimes it looks like patience. Sometimes it looks like silence. Sometimes it looks like working so hard they can't ignore you, and then choosing to ignore them anyway. The final straw came 2 weeks later when my parents organized what they called a family brainstorm night, a chance to support each other's projects and ideas, and when I showed up, notebook in hand, excited for once that maybe they were coming around. I walked into a room where Jake was already mid-pitch, complete with a slideshow, talking about a subscription box for dogs based on their zodiac signs, and I swear to you, my father clapped at the end like it was a Shark Tank finale while my mother teared up and said, "He just has that spark, doesn't he?" before turning to me and asking, "And how's your computer app?" That night, after they toasted to Jake's new journey and handed him a check just to help with branding and early logistics, I went home, opened my laptop, and bought a new domain name for my app's future enterprise site. Then filed the paperwork to register the business as an LLC. I didn't cry. I didn't sulk. I didn't vent online. I just decided, in that exact moment, that I was done playing small, done explaining, done seeking validation from people who only understood success when it came in the form of headlines or hype or charisma. I was building something real, and if they couldn't see it yet, that wasn't my burden to carry anymore. And here's the funny thing about underdogs. People only love you after you win. Before that, they treat your effort like a hobby, your grind like a phase, your dreams like a punchline. But what they never seem to realize is that quiet resentment makes for loud results. So, I stopped defending myself. I stopped telling them what I was working on. I stopped bringing my laptop to family dinners and pretending I wasn't rushing against every hour I had. I worked, and I watched, and I waited. Because some lessons can't be explained. They have to be shown. And mine? Mine was coming louder than any podcast, stronger than any pitch deck, and backed by something my brother never had to learn the hard way: grit. There's something profoundly satisfying about seeing the number 1 million written in a place you never thought you'd see it. Not in a lottery check, not in a fantasy bank account from some dream job, but in your own striped dashboard in real time. Staring back at you in a silent, glowing confirmation that every hour of loneliness, every ignored message, every dinner where you felt like a stranger at your own family table, was not just real, but now transformed into something solid, undeniable, and beautifully unignorable. I remember the moment with disturbing clarity, the way certain memories brand themselves into your brain like hot metal, because it wasn't flashy or loud or marked with champagne and streamers. It happened at 6:42 in the morning on a Tuesday. While I was still wearing last night's hoodie and finishing cold coffee that had sat untouched for hours, when I refreshed the analytics dashboard like I always did, not expecting anything in particular, just out of habit, and saw the number roll. Over 6 figures, then high 6, and then suddenly, without warning or fanfare, a quiet 7-digit total that made my heart stop, my breath catch, and my body freeze in the stillness of a moment I had dreamed about but never truly believed I'd see on my own terms. The truth is, you think you'll scream, or laugh, or cry when it finally happens, when the big milestone breaks the surface like a breaching whale from beneath years of effort and invisibility. But I didn't do any of that. I just sat there in silence, fingers hovering over the keyboard, not because I didn't know what to say, but because I knew finally that I didn't have to say anything at all, because the number said it for me, louder and clearer than any explanation or apology or pitch ever could. And after years of being doubted, dismissed, and talked over, that silence was the most delicious sound I'd ever heard. So I took a screenshot, cropped it neatly, and posted it to Facebook. No caption, no hashtags, no celebratory paragraph, just the number, the dashboard, and the quiet confidence of someone who had built something real, not for applause or validation, but because she refused to let the world tell her what she couldn't do. Within minutes, the likes started rolling in, then the comments, then the messages, first a trickle, then a flood, and suddenly, The very same people who hadn't returned my calls, who had ignored my updates or brushed them off like I was playing with software in the basement, were now asking to catch up, to connect, to hear the full story. My mom called 3 times that morning before leaving a voicemail that said she was so proud of how far I'd come, as if she'd been cheering me on from the sidelines this whole time and not funding my brother's podcast while referring to my business as something Emma's playing with for now. Jake sent a string of texts starting with "wow," followed by "is this real?" and finally, "let's hop on a call. I have some ideas," which I didn't even bother to open fully, because I already knew what was coming. Suddenly, the sister who had always been the background noise to his main act was now holding the mic, and he didn't know whether to clap or compete. Even David, my husband, the man who had shared my bed, my kitchen, and my most vulnerable nights of doubt, sent a message from his office that read, "We need to talk about what this means for us." As if the success I had earned in silence was suddenly a shared event, a joint accomplishment, despite the fact that when I stayed up coding past midnight, when I turned down trips and dinners to pay developers, when I cried quietly in the bathroom after a failed feature launch, he had never once offered help or hope, only skepticism wrapped in the polite language of practicality. I didn't respond to any of them, at least not immediately, because I needed to sit in that moment for myself, to feel every inch of it without dilution, without explanation, without being pulled into anyone else's orbit. And it was only later that afternoon, when I finally stood up, stretched my aching back, and made myself a sandwich, that I realized what I had done, what I had really, truly built, wasn't just an app or a business or a brand, but a version of myself that could no longer be ignored, no longer be patronized, and no longer be dismissed as Jake's older sister or David's wife, or that girl who works online. Of course, the news traveled fast, faster than I anticipated, faster than I liked, and within 48 hours, I was hearing from people I hadn't spoken to in years, old coworkers who used to interrupt me in meetings, ex-friends who vanished after high school, distant cousins who once rolled their eyes at every tech thing I posted, all of them now suddenly fascinated by my journey, eager to reconnect, curious about how I had pulled it off without a co-founder, without venture capital, without even so much as a single press mention. It was flattering, yes, but also deeply ironic, because when I had needed feedback, support, encouragement, or even a single ounce of belief, those people were nowhere to be found, and now, when I needed none of it, they couldn't stop calling. But nothing captured the bizarre shift more perfectly than what happened the following weekend, when my family invited me over for dinner, and I arrived to find the table set like it was a holiday, candles lit, wine uncorked, and Jake, of all people, sitting there with a printed-out pitch deck for a new content monetization platform that he wanted me to look at, casually dropping phrases like synergy and scaling, as if he were speaking my language now, as if a few buzzwords could erase the years of dismissal and mockery. And as he talked, gesturing with confidence, my mother beamed at me like she had orchestrated this reunion from a place of maternal wisdom, not fragile guilt. I didn't say much. I didn't have to. I nodded, I smiled, and I let them talk, because for once I had all the cards, and they knew it, even if they didn't have the words to say it out loud. And as Jake wrapped up his pitch with a hopeful grin and slid the papers toward me, I leaned back in my chair, looked around the room at the people who had once underestimated me, and thought to myself, not with bitterness, but with clarity, this is what it looks like when the underdog wins quietly. And the best part? I was just getting started. It's one thing to be underestimated, quietly overlooked, or politely dismissed by the people closest to you. It stings, yes, and it builds over time like sediment, creating a layer of hardened distance that you eventually learn to live with. But it's something else entirely when those same people, the very ones who doubted you most vocally and consistently, come crawling back not with apologies or accountability, but with carefully constructed excuses, empty flattery, and outstretched hands, pretending they were always on your side or that they simply misunderstood what you were doing, now desperate to hitch themselves to your momentum like barnacles clinging to the hull of a ship they once swore would never leave the dock. After the screenshot had done its work, had performed the silent scream I'd been choking down for years. I braced myself for the fallout, not with fear or anxiety, but with a kind of grim readiness. Because I had already rehearsed these conversations 100 times in my head, each scenario played out like a courtroom drama, only now the roles had reversed, and I wasn't sitting at the defendant's table anymore, trying to justify my decisions to a jury of skeptical relatives and a husband who had grown too comfortable dismissing me as the creative one who didn't quite understand how the real world worked. The phone calls came first, voicemails from my mother layered in a syrupy tone of concern mixed with pride, a passive-aggressive cocktail she'd perfected over the years, telling me how amazing I was and how she always knew I was onto something, though she conveniently skipped over the part where she once told me not to waste my prime years chasing apps, as if I were running barefoot through the desert collecting ideas like mirages. And then came Jake, oh Jake, with his performative awe and pseudo-humble approach, texting lines like, "Wow, big sis, that's incredible, and let's collaborate, I've got this new concept that could totally complement what you're doing," all written as if we were peers now, as if the last few years hadn't happened, as if he hadn't spent every family gathering interrupting me, laughing at my ideas, and soaking up the spotlight with his constant stream of half-baked schemes dressed up in startup lingo. But the real twist, the one I hadn't fully prepared myself for, came not from them, but from David, my husband, the man who had lived in the same house, shared the same bed, and yet somehow managed to exist in a completely different emotional climate when it came to what I was building, because once the screenshot went live and the calls started rolling in, he didn't respond with pride or celebration or even curiosity. He responded with calculation, suddenly showing an interest in our future, in next steps, in managing things together, using the plural possessive in ways that made my skin crawl, as if he hadn't spent the last 2 years treating my business like a quirky side hustle that he tolerated but didn't respect. I remember the moment it turned, when I knew, absolutely knew, that something had shifted beyond repair. We were standing in the kitchen, post-dinner silence hanging in the air like fog, and he casually said, while scrolling on his phone, "You know, maybe we should think about formalizing how we manage your earnings. It's going to affect our taxes, and technically, we're in this together, right?" I didn't answer immediately. I just stared at him, watching the muscles in his face, looking for some sign of self-awareness or even mild discomfort, but there was none. Just that bland confidence he wore like armor, the belief that because he had been around, he was somehow owed a percentage of the outcome. And that's when I realized he didn't just misunderstand what I had done, he fundamentally didn't believe I could have done it without him, or at the very least, without his passive, background presence serving as some kind of implied contribution. And in that moment, the weight of every small slight, every eye roll, every comment about me burning out on this thing eventually, came crashing down in a quiet fury that didn't make me shout or cry, but made me sharper, more precise, like a scalpel, separating muscle from bone. The next morning, I changed the passwords on every account: Stripe, hosting, legal, email, then called a lawyer I'd been following on Twitter for months, someone who specialized in protecting female founders from opportunistic partners. And while I waited for our scheduled consult, I began combing through my files, screenshots, emails, voice memos, every offhand remark, every condescending joke, every little moment I had previously dismissed or swallowed for the sake of harmony, and assembled them not as evidence for court, but as proof for myself that I wasn't being paranoid, that the erosion of respect in our marriage hadn't been subtle or accidental, but systematic and dismissive, and that no amount of shared groceries or weekend trips could make up for the lack of belief when it truly mattered. And as I prepared to protect what I had built, Jake escalated, showing up unannounced at the co-working space I occasionally used downtown, dressed like he was auditioning for a TED Talk, laptop under one arm, grinning like he'd just walked into a surprise party held in his honor, and, before I could even ask why he was there, he launched into a monologue about this amazing synergy between his brand and my platform, how the narrative of siblings conquering the tech world together would be irresistible to the press, and how we could blow this thing up if we just teamed up and made it a family thing. I let him finish, nodded politely, and then asked the receptionist to escort him out. I didn't yell. I didn't argue. I didn't even bother to explain why it was never going to happen. Because I had finally learned that the best kind of power isn't noisy or theatrical. It's the ability to decide who gets access to your time, your space, and your story, and in that moment, Jake got none of it. Later that week, David served me with paperwork, thinly veiled behind the language of concern and planning, but unmistakably a first move in claiming what he now saw as marital assets, not personal triumphs, and as I read the language, the phrases about community property and intellectual contributions, I didn't feel fear or even sadness. I felt insulted because the man who hadn't believed in me when the app made $0 now wanted half of what I'd built after it hit $1 million. But here's the thing about building something in silence, about being ignored long enough to find your own voice. By the time they finally listen, you don't need to speak. You just move, you just act, you just decide, and in that moment, I knew exactly what I needed to do next. And as I signed the counter petition with calm hands and a steel spine, I thought to myself, not with vengeance, but with clarity, this wasn't revenge. This was reclamation. There is a certain cold, deliberate calm that settles over you when you stop needing people to understand your journey, when the urge to explain, to justify, to ask for recognition simply evaporates, not because you've given up, but because you've reached a point where your reality is no longer up for debate, where what you've built speaks louder than any apology, louder than every dinner conversation that turned into a silent contest for respect, and far louder than the years of patronizing comments wrapped in the disguise of concern or love, which now echo in your memory like the faint hum of an engine that finally ran out of gas. In the days that followed the legal documents from David and the awkward silence from Jake after being gently yet firmly shown the door at my co-working space, something shifted in me, not overnight, not with dramatic flair, but in that slow, tectonic way that earthquakes are born, a grinding beneath the surface that you feel before you see, and when it finally erupts, nothing is left the same, especially the version of yourself you used to water down so others could stay comfortable. What they hadn't understood, what they had never tried to understand, was that what I built was never just about money or even independence. It was about reclaiming a version of myself that existed long before I became someone's wife, someone's sister, someone's daughter, a version of me that had once believed she could do anything until the world, with its soft jabs and sharp silences, told her over and over again that her ideas weren't serious, her goals were too abstract, and that maybe she should just be grateful for stability and stay in her lane. I didn't post another screenshot. I didn't make a speech or write a thread or take a victory lap. I got quiet again, but this time with purpose, with intention, with the kind of silence that builds fortresses instead of cages. First, I hired 2 more developers, women, both freelancers I had admired for a long time, both working mothers who knew exactly what it meant to juggle expectations and ambition while being underestimated by the very people who claimed to support them. Then I sat down with my lawyer and outlined every asset, every move, every contingency I had been quietly planning since long before David decided my success suddenly involved him. We created a structure so tight and forward-looking that even if he tried to grab at pieces of what I'd built, all he'd find were shadows, no access, no leverage, and certainly no claim to a single moment of the late nights or early mornings he had so casually dismissed while I was neck-deep in code and customer support emails. And in a move that was more for myself than for the audience I didn't need, I made one small but cutting gesture. I anonymously paid off the remaining business debt that my parents had been carrying since the pandemic, a quiet, symbolic act that served as both a balm for old wounds and a message they'd never be able to fully decipher, because while they had chosen to fund Jake's every wild idea, while they had cheered his mediocre efforts with full-hearted praise and greeted my milestones with lukewarm interest, I had still, in the end, chosen to be the one who cleaned up the mess, not because they asked or deserved it, but because I needed to know I could, and that I no longer needed anything in return, not approval, not gratitude, not even acknowledgement. Jake, perhaps sensing that the tides had turned for good, sent one final email, written in a tone that hovered somewhere between apology and manipulation, describing how family should stick together, how we were stronger as a team, and how the media would love a reunion arc. I didn't reply. I didn't delete it either. I let it sit in my inbox like a fossil, a reminder of the old script that had finally been burned. As for David, his attempts to negotiate a settlement quickly fizzled when my legal team presented records of his complete non-involvement, combined with evidence of his dismissiveness, his passive-aggressive sabotage, and his late-night attempts to access accounts he wasn't authorized to touch. When it became clear he had no leverage, just a bruised ego and an outdated sense of entitlement, the silence returned, this time from him. I didn't celebrate the divorce. There was no joy in watching something disintegrate that had once been filled with hope, but there was a deep, stabilizing peace in knowing that the version of me who had once needed his approval to feel real no longer existed. And in her place was someone far less polite, but infinitely more powerful, someone who didn't need to explain why she chose herself. And then, once the dust had settled and the bank account was stable, and the team was growing, and the platform had been rebranded with a sleek new interface and a marketing strategy focused entirely on freelancers who, like me, had been dismissed or patronized or underpaid for too long, I did something I had dreamed about quietly for over a year. I launched a grant fund, seeded with $50,000 of my own revenue, to support women-led solo businesses in the first year of launch. No strings attached, no mentorship speeches, no equity claims, just a simple application and a single question. What would you build if no one rolled their eyes when you said it out loud? The announcement made waves, not viral, not headline news, but it spread in the right circles, reached the right people, and sparked the kind of quiet revolution that happens when you stop trying to be the exception and start trying to be the example. And as the first round of recipients began emailing me with their ideas, their gratitude, their fire, I felt something I hadn't felt in years. Not pride exactly, not triumph, but a kind of grounded joy. The kind that comes not from recognition but from alignment, from finally knowing who you are, what you can do, and who you never needed to become in order to be respected. One afternoon, I sat at my favorite cafe, the one I used to avoid when money was tight, and watched the world pass outside the window, my phone resting beside me, buzzing quietly with notifications I no longer felt the urgency to check. One message came in from Jake again. Another from my mother. A third from someone who had once called me unfocused. I looked at them. I didn't respond. I just took a sip of my coffee and let the silence stretch. Because the truth is, I built this without them. Without their help, without their faith, without their applause. I built it in the dark while they were watching someone else, waiting for someone flashier, easier to believe in. And now that it's built, now that it's strong, they want in. They want explanations. They want forgiveness. They want access. But what they don't understand, and maybe never will, is that the most powerful thing I ever built wasn't the app, or the business, or even the money. It was the woman who no longer needs to ask whether she's allowed to succeed. She just does.